All right, I've been waiting on this one for a while because I think while the radical left is clearly the biggest threat to gaming, they're not the only ones who could have a potentially negative impact on the hobby. Because last week, Daily Wire commentator Matt Walsh released a video where he stated that video games are at least partially responsible for desensitizing children to violence. He said it's not good for kids to spend an exorbitant amount of time consuming graphically violent content, which, sure, totally agree with that idea that spending an exorbitant amount of time doing anything really is always going to be an issue. But then he continued on, and I really think this is where he made a mistake. Because he said that even if the content is fictional and virtual and imaginary, it doesn't mean that it has no influence just because it's fictional. And that among other things, it can have the effect of desensitizing the mind and soul to violence. Now, while I have a deep respect for Walsh and I completely understand where he's coming from, unfortunately, he's just wrong on this one. Now, granted, young children shouldn't be playing uber violent video games. Like, yeah, no duh. Kindergartners shouldn't be kicking demon ass in Doom. Let's wait until they're a little bit older for that one. But what Walsh is doing is taking an argument that has been made 1,000 times before and repackaging it for the modern age. That's the idea that violent content, whether it's in books or TV shows or in movies, or I guess now video games, causes people to become violent if the material itself contains violence. Because Walsh certainly isn't the first person to make this argument. Following the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary in 2012, the media revealed that the shooter was a loner who had spent most of his time alone in his basement playing video games, which of course included some first-person shooters, some of those violent video games that Matt Walsh probably isn't a fan of. But reportedly, his favorite game was Dance Dance Revolution, not exactly the orgy of violence you'd kind of think. But still, the narrative started to spread that it was his obsession with violent video games that drove him to kill. The same was true of the Parkland High School shooter in 2018, and the Aurora movie theater shooter in 2012, and even back to Columbine in 1999. And on that Columbine note, while the shooters were reportedly fans of violent video games like Doom and Quake, they were also interested in firearms, which the media immediately picked up on. And I don't think we're going to try and argue that an interest in real-life guns makes someone a killer, but somehow an interest in fake violence does? On top of that, violent incidents like the mass shootings that are supposedly connected to video games are outliers in a society that is overall becoming less violent. FBI statistics show that since 1992, violent crime has actually been on the decline. Side note here, the Super Nintendo came out in 1991 and was widely considered to be the console that really launched home gaming in the West. One of the best-selling games on that console, by the way, was Mortal Kombat. You've probably heard of that one. It's the game that was so violent and so terrible and so disgusting that a litany of congressional hearings were held to discuss it. And it came out as crime was trending down and continued to trend down. Because on top of that data, there's a general downturn in violence, and the studies that have been deliberately addressing this topic show that there's no connection between violent video games and violent behavior. A 2019 study by Christopher Ferguson from Stetson University and C.K. John Wang from Nanyang Technological University found that there was no long-term predictive relationship between aggressive video games and future aggression in youth. Fun fact, a similar study was done in 2015 that showed no connection between games with allegedly sexist content and real-life sexism, because that's an argument that has existed since the dawn of time from the left, that sexist content in art creates sexist people. I have zero doubt that Walsh means well and that he wants to see a reduction in crime, but do you see like a similarity here? While you can empathize with Matt Walsh's position, playing into fear-mongering surrounding video games is not the answer, whether that's sexism or violence or whatever you don't like. I've made this point before because it's really not helpful to alienate a group of people like gamers who are sick and tired of the woke left in their spaces. Video games are hugely popular, and it makes zero sense to try and punish players either from the right or from the left for indulging in something that makes them happy and is proven not to increase violence. Instead, we should counter these narratives. Again, often coming from the left, that video games need to be sanitized in order to stave off disaster, because that's what the woke does. It claims that bad things in video games or movies or TV, whatever, perpetuate harm. PETA, by the way, tries to keep arguing that Pokemon is something that's going to get people engaged in animal abuse or dogfighting, which I think we can all agree is nonsense. I hope we can, at least. Kids recognize that it's not real. and they could separate the fact from the fantasy. So let's extend that logic out to violence in video games too. Give kids age-appropriate games. For sure, like I said, I wouldn't play Call of Duty with a first grader. But let's put to bed this idea that games are like causing horrific acts of violence, because they're just not. The data doesn't show it. It's actively alienating a potential ally in the fight against the radical left, and it's based on emotion and not truth. So no, Matt Walsh, love you to death, but sorry, video games don't cause violence. Now, that said, who's up for some Mortal Kombat?